Welcome back, and now we're going to get into the difficult topic of law, international law. And this particular tutorial is going to focus on the role and powers of enforcement agencies. So these are the government health and safety inspectors, the people who, they're basically the health and safety police, essentially. Before we get into that, I have to start by talking a little bit about the International Labour Organization, which creates international treaties. Now, this course, to be clear, is not going to talk about your particular country's legislation. Now, all of these different countries have laws. They're all different laws. Some similarities sometimes, particularly if you are a country that used to be part of an empire, used to be a colony, maybe you've inherited some aspects of French law or British law and so on. So there might be some similarities, but essentially your laws are a bit different in terms of the names and exactly what they require. So NEBOSH cannot teach you about your country's laws. You are going to have to make some efforts to look up your own laws. If NEBOSH decide to ask you a question about the law, about breaches of legal duties, they are going to focus on ILO conventions and recommendations. So these are international treaties. So the ILO is the International Labour Organization. It is essentially a membership body of lots of different countries. So your country, my country, we are probably members of the ILO. We send government representatives to ILO meetings and they have negotiations and they will create a treaty, an international treaty. Now, to be clear, this international treaty is not legally binding on the country. What it requires is that a country who has signed the treaty, so let's say the United Kingdom, my country, we could sign the treaty, but that treaty is not UK law. So it doesn't create any legal duties here in the UK, because, you know, as a British citizen, I do not answer to the ILO, to be clear. So the ILO treaty has no impact on me whatsoever. But what the ILO treaty does is that it requires a government, a national government, to ratify the treaty. So that, listen, you signed the treaty, now take it back to your parliament, your government, you ratify it, that means you sign it, you agree to it internally, and then you are required to create your own law, your own national law to do what this treaty from the ILO says. Now, I know that sounds a bit complicated, but you are not going to be asked about your national legislations, you are going to be asked about breaches of the ILO treaty, even though in practice, it doesn't really matter if your organization is in breach of an ILO treaty or an ILO recommendation. It's not law in the normal sense. Now, we're going to talk about ILO Convention C155. This is the ILO's main convention on how businesses, how organizations should manage occupational health and safety. ILO C155. We're going to take a moment to pause, and I would like you to use Google to find out if your country has signed and ratified the C155 convention. If you're watching this and you're a NEBOSH student, did you know that you have a ton of resources on the Compassa website which you can use? Many of them are very, very cheap. You've got our YouTube section here, loads of free advice here, but if you want some study books, if you want exam technique documents, exam technique guides, instructions on how to do your NG2 or IG2 practical project, you can download those at some very, very reasonable prices from our website. And if you wanted hands-on tutor support with full access to all of our tutorials, guides, me and my colleagues at the tips of your fingers, consider signing up for our NEBOSH Rescue package. You'll get access to our full course and tutor support at a heavily discounted rate. And, well, frankly, you'll struggle to find pass rates that are as consistently high anywhere else. Let's get back to the advice. Let's see how you work that out. Maybe you couldn't work that out, so I'm going to try and do that for my country. So C155, list of countries that ratified it. And let's see what we can find. So we've got ratifications of ILO conventions. We'll just click on that. And so this is in relation to C155, Occupational Safety and Health Convention of 1981. And we can look down the list, and hopefully you found this list, but I'm looking for United Kingdom. And interestingly, I cannot find the United Kingdom on this list. So we have not ratified this. I can't find Great Britain or England or anything like that. either. So who has ratified it? Well, we've got the likes of Russia. They've ratified it, Russian Federation. We've got Korea, South Korea, Moldova, Norway, Sweden. And you can see they've ratified as of 2002. And we've got some interesting mentions here. We've got Italy. Italy's not in force yet. It will enter in force for Italy this year in 2024, 12th October 2024 as of filming. Now it doesn't matter if, from a NEBOSH perspective, from a NEBOSH exam perspective, it doesn't matter if your country's ratified it or not. On the exam you could be asked about the breaches of the C155 convention in the scenario. So just assume that the organization in the scenario has ratified it. So what does this 155 convention have in it? Well, let's take a little bit of a look at it, shall we? Let's just start with the structure. So we just Google C155, we'll find it here. It's not a very interesting read, I'll be honest. It's a bit boring. We've got a preamble, we've got a scope and some definitions. Okay, the definitions kind of matter. So here we are, we've got some definitions there. What are workers? All employed persons, including public employees. We've got the national policy. So this is essentially, this is what the government should do, the national governments. This is what your national country policy should be. And this is the action at the national level. So this is what we want the government to do at the national level. And then later we have the action at the level of the undertaking. The undertaking is your organization. So this is what the ILO wants organizations to do. And then finally, we've got some final provisions there. Now, just remember that the action at the level of the undertaking does not create by itself any legal requirements. It is the government, the national government has to create laws, its own national laws, to require undertakings to do all of these things here. And we're going to study those in another tutorial a little bit later. But right now, just to get back on topic, we are talking about the role and powers of enforcement agencies. And so, C155 requires national governments to create health and safety laws, their own national safety laws. And they must also create a system to enforce those laws, which means they have to create an enforcement agency with enforcement inspectors who are going to inspect work safety standards and to advise organizations and also to take action against organizations who do not meet the standard. So there has to be a system of laws, monitoring and enforcement with penalties, legal penalties. And they should also create guidance documents, advice to share with employers on how to comply with the law. So C155 requires member states to create a system of enforcement and to create enforcement agencies. Now, what do the enforcement agencies do? What is their role? Well, their purpose is firstly to advise the government on health and safety law, what laws should the government create? And it should also advise employers on how to comply with those laws. That might mean also publishing guidance documents and codes of practice. In terms of enforcement, these enforcement agencies should proactively target certain industries and certain businesses. So they usually target the higher risk businesses. So mining, agriculture, construction, and so on. So they spend more effort on the higher risk industries. If you work in a shop or a library or an office or a hotel, maybe there's less enforcement because you're quite a low risk industry relative to the others. So they target and they inspect. If they find health and safety issues, they then take various actions. They don't just inspect, they also investigate. So we as organizations, we are required to report to the agency accidents, and we'll talk about that later and what that looks like. But we might have to report certain incidents to the agency. That agency then might decide to come and visit us like a police officer and investigate the crime. And if they find that we have acted below the standard, if we've broken the law, they're going to take some kind of action. And that might include serving some kind of order on us, an order to force us to do something, or it might even include prosecuting us, where they take us to a court, and if we are found guilty, we could be fined. or even jailed if it's a person being prosecuted. Now, critically in this is where I really want you to pay attention, because you can get exam questions on this. You can get exam questions on the powers of the enforcement inspector. So these enforcement inspectors usually have a range of powers. Now, the powers do vary from country to country, so I don't know what the powers are in your country. I'm going to tell you what the powers are here in the UK. And in most countries, there are some similarities. They do have a lot of power because they are basically the health and safety police. One of the powers is that they can visit and enter a workplace. And so they can just knock on the door and say, "Hi, we're here to inspect the health and safety standards. Here's my card, here's my authority. I am now going to come in." And you have to let them in. It's worth bearing in mind that if you do not let them in, if you do not cooperate, you are probably committing a crime yourself. So if you say, "No, you're not coming in, I'm not letting you," that is a crime. You could be arrested for that and then prosecuted personally. So they can enter, and they can then walk around and they can inspect the workplace, which means they can look at things, they can look at equipment, they can look at how things are run, they can stand and watch. Part of the inspection might include taking some photos. Your company might have a policy of no photos because it's all confidential. Doesn't matter. The inspector is allowed to take pictures. They're allowed to take evidence. They can measure things. They can take samples of things. If they find a piece of dangerous equipment, a dangerous machine, a dangerous saw, a dangerous drill, they might decide to seize it, to take it away, either as evidence or just to destroy it because it's too dangerous to be used. If a machine has caused an accident, so let's say someone decided to climb into a machine and the machine turned on and it killed them, quite a serious accident, they might decide to condemn the machine while it's examined by an engineer. So that means they could force you to turn it off, to put barriers around it, maybe a sign on it, say, "Do not use this machine." And if you do use the machine, you're breaking the law. So they can force you to leave an area or a machine undisturbed. They can obtain information. They're allowed to collect any information. That includes paperwork, risk assessments, training records, maintenance records. There are any record, including emails, by the way. So they can take emails which might be evidence of a crime. And then they can speak to people. So they could interview witnesses, interview non-witnesses, managers, supervisors who may have some information to be shared. They're out to interview people and they can demand answers from them. Here in the UK, they can also force you to give them assistance and facilities as required. So facilities might include an office, a place to do the interviews. They may require access to the internet. It could be as simple as giving them access to a photocopier so they can take copies of the documents that they are taking away. They can also send people for medical checkups. So if they suspect that people's health has been damaged, say by large quantities of dust or fumes, they could force those people to go for a medical examination. And finally, one of their powers is to take action. We'll look at the types of action they can take in a moment, but they can take enforcement action against people or against the company. Okay, so in this exercise, I would like you to see if you can sort out the role of the agencies from the powers of the agencies. All right, that's an important exercise because you could get asked about the agency's powers. And remember, this is in relation to the scenario. Maybe in the scenario, you have an enforcement inspector and you might have to comment on what they did and whether that was within their powers or not within their powers. So let's just try an exercise on that basis. Here, I'm going to show you a case study. It's a longer case study this time. And then there's a whole load of powers. And I would like to ask you, which of the powers did the enforcement agency inspector exercise? And if you can't see all the answers, and if you can't see the check button, scroll down to the bottom until you can find the check button. Okay, so that's actually a kind of exam question in a sense. Obviously, you're not going to have a multiple choice questionnaire, but you might get a case study with an inspector and you might be asked to comment on what they did and didn't do. So what did they do in this particular case? Well, they were investigating an accident, weren't they? So they have the power to investigate incidents, and here they were exercising that power. And they have collected some evidence. they have been taking photos, and they've taken documentation, and they have interviewed people as well. They've interviewed witnesses and the manager. And they also seized a machine. Now, firstly, they tried to require the manager to leave the machine undisturbed, but the manager seemed to be resistant to that. So, being cautious, the inspector then said, well, actually, if I can't trust you to leave it undisturbed, I'm going to take it away. They then decided to take enforcement action because they served an order to force the employer to make some improvements. Now, which ones did they not exercise? Well, there's nothing in the scenario to say that they obtained facilities or assistance. So you could say they had this power, but they chose not to exercise it. You might get a mark for that at the exam. There's no evidence that they asked for facilities or assistance. And they also had the power to send people for medical checkups, but there's no evidence that they did this. You could get a mark for that, possibly, but I can't guarantee it. Let's move on to the next topic, which is about the enforcement action. So what actions can they take? So they have a power to take action. What actions can they take? Now, it varies again from country to country. So I'm going to give you some broad rules here. One of the rules is that, first of all, they can give advice. So if it's a very, very minor issue, they may decide to just give some advice. That's maybe a verbal advice or even a letter, some written advice on how to improve. But there are a couple of what we call formal notices or formal orders that most agencies can take. And the first one would be to serve an order requiring you to make an improvement of some kind. So here in the UK, we call that an improvement notice. It might be called something different in your country, but it's a formal instruction saying you must make this improvement. And you have a deadline, you have a time to make that improvement. And if you fail to make that improvement, you are breaking the law. So this is mandatory. Now, there may be a mechanism to appeal this. You may be able to challenge the order in a court, possibly. We can here, but that can be quite difficult to do. When do we serve improvement notices? Well, usually when there is a breach of the law, which must be rectified. It's not a minor issue. It's quite a serious breach of the law. It must be rectified. There's no fine on these. No fine, there's no court case. It's just get it done within the next 6 weeks, something like that. I once got an improvement notice. The enforcement agency, the inspector, was walking around my factory, and we had tractors in the factory. And a tractor driver had parked the tractor outside the toilets, and the driver had left the key in the ignition of the tractor. Now, that means that anyone could just jump onto the tractor and start driving the tractor around. And we are supposed to reserve the use of vehicles to only trained, authorized persons. That was what's required. But if the key's in the ignition, then anyone, any unauthorized, untrained person could just jump on the tractor and just move it. And so as soon as the inspector saw the key in the ignition and no driver, I was like, where's the driver? Driver's not. And I said, well, the driver's probably in the toilet. I said, in the toilet. Right, okay. So out came the book. And then I got the improvement notice, and I had 4 weeks to improve it was quite a broad notice. It was to improve the management of vehicles. It wasn't just a key, it was a whole load more stuff I had to do. That was one notice. There's another type of notice or another type of order, which we often call a prohibition notice, or it's an order which prohibits you from doing something. That could be prohibits a task, or it prohibits use of a piece of equipment. These are reserved not only when there's a breach of the law, but also when there is a serious and imminent danger. So there's a serious imminent danger of falling or someone being electrocuted and so on. I got one of these once. An enforcement inspector visited us, and it was my first day at this particular factory. We had just taken over this factory, we'd bought it, we'd gone in, started to make changes. The changes were very unpopular. One of the workers reported us to the enforcement agency to get us into trouble, and it worked. The inspector comes in and sees that we have dozens of people, dozens of workers working at height on platforms with no guardrails. No guardrails, just a flat surface. You could just fall straight off. And this inspector, she walked in and she went, wow, okay. And out came the book. Immediately, out came the book. And she prohibited all work at height in this building, all of it. And we had dozens of people working at height doing this production job. All of it stopped almost immediately. Stop everything now. Big panic. And we had to make some serious changes very, very quickly. We had to build guardrails on all the platforms very, very quickly to get her to lift the notice, to allow us to work again. Very, very disruptive, this. Reserved only when there's a breach of the law and there's a serious and imminent danger. The final power. Power? Not a power. I'm getting confused as well. It's not a power. Here are the powers earlier. Those are the powers, right? Those are the powers. Don't get confused. If you get a question about powers, that's what it's on about. If you get a question about the enforcement action that could be taken, it's on about this here. The final type of enforcement action they can take is they could prosecute. So they do this when there's a particularly serious case. Now, to be clear, there doesn't have to be an injury for this. Here in the UK, we can get prosecuted even when there's no injury. We just had to have a serious breach, a serious risk, which we failed to control. But no one's been hurt. Doesn't matter if no one's been hurt. Doesn't matter, you still broke the law. The law requires you to keep people safe. The law doesn't require you to prevent injuries. The law says keep people safe. You didn't keep them safe. Doesn't matter whether they got hurt or not. So they could prosecute the organization, and in some cases they can prosecute the people as well. Obviously, when they prosecute an organization, the only real penalty is going to be a fine, a large financial penalty. You cannot put an organization in jail, but a person can be put in jail. You can fine a person and you can put them in jail, and that does sometimes happen. Okay, on that basis, what I would like you to do to try and avoid the confusion that I myself had just a moment ago, I would like you to sort out the powers of the enforcement agencies from the enforcement actions they can take. All right, that can be a little bit confusing because one of their powers is to take enforcement action. They have the power to take enforcement action. But then in the enforcement action column, we expected you to say things like give advice, serve improvement orders, to serve prohibition orders, and to prosecute. Those are the actions that they can take. It's also worth noting that in most countries, the enforcement inspector does not have the power to fine you. They don't have the power to levy a fine. It's usually the court who levies the fine. It's the court that decides if you've committed the crime. Are you guilty? Yes. In that case, here's the fine. Most places, the inspector cannot do that. They may, in some countries, be able to serve small fines. You know, like a police officer can give you a parking ticket or something, a small fine. But big fines is usually from a court. One final thing here then is, where can we find information on how to comply with the law? What is the role played by international standards? So there are international standards. I say international standards. These are, it's not a law, but it's a standard. It's like a rule, it's a common practice which is used internationally by a lot of different companies. And these could be ISO standards, the International Standardization Organization. They can have a international standard. Or you could also have ILO codes of practice, the International Labour Organization Code of Practice. Here's a code of practice. It's not a legal document, but it is a useful document which explains how you can manage a particular risk. So these standards are useful because they're gonna give you practical advice on how to manage a particular risk or how to carry out a particular activity. For example, how often should you test your emergency lighting? You know, there's an international standard explaining that. How should you manage the risks in, say, construction or agriculture? There's an ILO code of practice on that. Now, what these do, they can give you a lot of credibility. If you can prove that you comply with the standard, it gives you credibility with your customers, with your insurers, and with the enforcement agencies. So you could become compliant with an ISO standard. And also, they standardize rules. One of the issues we have internationally is that every country has different rules. Now, I myself, I've managed health and safety in companies which had sites all over the world. Malaysia, India, Africa, Turkey, Europe, America. They've all got different rules. So how do I keep on top of all these different rules? And also, if we have different rules in different countries, doesn't that say that our workers, say in India, are less precious than the workers in America, which have stricter rules? No, of course not, of course not. So all our workers in every country are all equal and are all just as important, you know, all sacred and precious. You know, go back to the moral argument for that. So doesn't it make sense that we put the same amount of effort in, we standardize the rules? So having international standards like following an ILO code of practice or complying with an ISO document means that you essentially standardize the rules across all the countries, which makes things simpler and is fairer across all workers. Now let's do a little bit of an exercise. I would like us to use the power of Google for this. Let's see if you can find the ILO code of practice for construction. Go. Press play when you've done it. All right, welcome back. Don't know if you managed that, but let's just type in ILO code. Oh, funny enough, construction kind of comes up there. So ILO code of practice, safety and health in construction. And I've been there before, so there's my link. And there we are. So let's take a look at the document. So it was published in 2022. It's a new version. It's not that pretty in terms of the branding, but looks very basic. Clearly don't have a lot of money, the ILO, for graphic design. Let's take a look at the table of contents. So you'll see why this is useful. If you work in a construction company, this is super useful. So here we've got general duties of various people, of the employers, of the clients, of the workers, of the designers, the engineers, the architects. So we have general duties. Now remember, these are not legal duties. This is just a guidance document, which is useful for telling you how things should be managed. You could say, we comply with this guidance document, which is better than all of the legal requirements in the world. It's got some information on management systems. So what should your policy look like? What should you do to help workers participate? You know, a lot of these topics are things we're going to talk about on this course, like policy. Yeah, we're going to do that soon. Worker participation, we're going to do that. Responsibility, that's coming up shortly. Hazard identification, risk assessment. We're going to talk about most or maybe all of these topics. Training, the reporting of accidents and diseases, the various types of PPE that should be provided. Then we go on to things like welfare. So what welfare facilities should a construction company provide to workers? Then we've got various requirements around safety, falls from height, fire, housekeeping, asbestos, silica, radiation, heat, noise, vibration, and so on, and so on. So a super useful document. It goes on and on and on, doesn't it? There's loads of it, all relate, hundreds of pages this. Can you see how this might be useful to you later when you do your practical project? Now, at the moment, at current time of filming, the practical project is a risk assessment. If you're in a construction company and you have to do a risk assessment, this document kind of tells you how certain risks should be controlled. If you've got some kind of pneumatic tool, is that there, pneumatic tool, you could use this to help you write your risk assessment and make recommendations to improve the safety of use of your pneumatic tools. So, super useful document. Let's just take a look and see if we can find any other documents. So I'll just go back. If we just type in ILO code of practice, we may find others. So just type safety use of chemicals, use of machinery. There's also a code of practice for the reporting, for accident reporting. So let's have a quick look at that. It's not very pretty, this one. But there's a code of practice on how things should be recorded and then reported. Let's finish off with a short exercise. What I'd like you to do is match the enforcement action taken with the unacceptable situation. All right, so on that exercise, you were dragging and dropping things around. Did you see how the more severe the situation, the more severe the action was? So when someone was killed, that went to a prosecution. But if there's just an issue of tidiness, then there was just an order to improve the levels of housekeeping. You see, so usually the action is proportionate to the severity of the crime. So there we are. Anyway, we're done for this tutorial. It's been quite a long one. We've covered some basics around the ILO, recommendations and ratification and so on. And now we're going to get a little bit deeper into what those ILO conventions require. So please, as always, check your written materials and I'll see you in the next tutorial.